welcome Noam Chomsky. I'm glad to have him once again in a conversation. And today we will be kind of talking about two books and right at the end about a third. The first book we'll be talking about is a book written many years ago by Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky, which is called Manufacturing Consent. And the second one has a related title, and the German translation just appeared. It's called Consequences of Capitalism, Manufacturing Discontent and Resistance. So that alone carries a little bit of an optimistic message. It's not just the case that false consent can be manufactured, but the opposite can also be true. And let's now begin with the first book a little bit. It will appear in the spring of 2023 in German. And appeared in the original in 1988. And that book also had some roots and a background. In 1979, Noam and his colleague Edward S. Herman wrote a 2-volume book called The Political Economy of Human Rights. And in the political economy of human rights, they talked a lot about violence and terror. And they distinguished two kinds of terror as presented in the Western media, namely constructive terror, benign terror, and nefarious and mythical terror. Can you talk about that a little bit? What did you mean at the time by that?
I should say the terms themselves are Ed Herman's terms. He was very good at developing nice, pithy names for things. Benign terror is the kind that basically that we don't care, it doesn't matter. Constructive terror is the kind that we like. It's actually doing the right kind of thing. Nefarious terror is the kind that some enemy carries out. This has nothing to do with scale or nature or anything like that. It's a matter of the agency. So some kind of terror is fine, we carry it out. Some kind of terror is terrible, an enemy carries it out. And then there's some kind that just doesn't matter so much, so we just call that benign terror, we don't care about it. And these categories are all the time. I mean, the United States, we were writing in 1988, we have another update of it back in the about 15 years later, and it's just different choices. So in 1988, the most constructive terror was in 3 areas in Central America. That was constructive terror. The Reagan administration was carrying out vicious terrorist wars. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed, state terror mostly. There have been truth commissions since which verified what we said. It's already well established that it's almost the terror is almost entirely that of the armed, mostly the state forces, armed, trained by the United States. In one case in Central America, the population actually had a army to defend it, Nicaragua. So therefore the terror was anti-government terror organized, trained by the United States. There was no particular secret about this. In fact, the United States was actually condemned by the World Court for what was called unlawful use of force, which means international terrorism. This was in its war against Nicaragua. The case had to keep to very narrow grounds because when the United States accepted the jurisdiction of the World Court, it exempted itself from the major forms of terror.
At the time when you published the book, the 2-volume book, you also said that the 2 volumes are about 2 things, namely 1, facts, and 2, beliefs. So the whole book, the whole 2-volume book is about how the actual facts in the world are reflected to a system of beliefs and ideology. And you said that in Central America and Latin America, in some countries, you had truth commissions. And and in other countries where you also had a lot of constructive terror, such as Indonesia, you didn't have that. What kind of a difference does that make, having a truth commission or not having a truth commission?
In some cases, there has the civilizing effect of the social and educational processes have led to a point where there's a willingness to face the facts. In others, there just isn't. Like, take where Indonesia has just not reached that point, and there's no external pressure. The reason in Indonesia there can't be any external pressure is that the United States strongly supported the terror, and Europe pretty much went along with it as well.
Yes.
Also Australia. In fact, when the Suharto regime took over in 1965, it carried out an incredible massacre. Hundreds of thousands of people slaughtered right away. Regime of torture, violence, repression was regarded by the international human rights organizations as the worst in the world, but it was welcomed in the West. In fact, it wasn't secret. Like, take a look at the press. I reviewed the press in a separate book in 1965 when it came out. I read the New York Times. The leading liberal commentator in the New York Times, James Reston, had a column on it in which the headline was "A Gleam of Light in Asia." What he was describing was what the editorial next to him called a staggering mass slaughter, in which the editorial praised the United States,
yes,
for not taking credit for it, so that credit could be given to the Indonesian generals themselves. We wouldn't take credit for it from them, what they called the moderate generals, who were carrying out a mass slaughter, which was a gleam of light in Asia. The reason was it destroyed the only real political organization in the country, which happened to call itself the Communist Party, which, whatever that's supposed to have meant, but it was a progressive party, a party of the poor. It was called by the scholars, Australian scholars who dealt with it, basically a party of the poor. It was wiped out. Indonesia was thrown open to foreign investment. Its rich resources were available for the West. So it was a gleam of light in Asia. Wasn't only the Times. The Time magazine had a full issue, about a dozen pages, devoted to what it called the boiling blood myth, which again was greeted as a just wonderful occasion. You have to look at the background. There's a rich background. It has to do even with the Vietnam War. In fact, a couple of years later, McGeorge Bundy, who was the national security advisor for Kennedy and Johnson, reflected that the United States could have pulled out of Vietnam in 1965 because the main result, the main goal was achieved, namely no concern that Indonesia might turn into an independent development. And
I read that just recently in an important book, which is called the Jakarta Method.
Yeah, Jakarta Method. It's a very good book, which goes in much more detail into what we could say then, but it's basically the story. And it's called the Jakarta Method because it's a model. So when the United States was about to overthrow the democratic socialist regime in Chile, the messages being sent around clandestinely, probably by the CIA, where Jakarta is coming. Watch it. We're going to carry out a boiling bloodbath here. So it's the Jakarta Method. Go back to the origins of the Vietnam War. Main concern was that independent development in Vietnam might set off, borrow Kissinger's terms for Chile, it might be a virus that would spread contagion. And the main contagion they were concerned with was Indonesia.
Yeah, that's actually something that you talk about at length in the book Consequences of Capitalism, that the Vietnam War had a larger geopolitical background, and that Vietnam as such was not so very important in terms of its raw materials and whatever. It was the threat of people having the crazy idea of using their own resources for themselves instead of international corporations, and to be politically independent of the United States.
Let me give you an example from close by, what's called our little region over here. Secretary of War Henry Stimson referred to Latin America as our little region over here, which has never bothered anyone. He was at the time explaining why all regional systems have to be dismantled. Imperial preference systems and others can't have them in the post-war world. They're impediments to US investment and trade and takeover. But we're going to keep one regional system intact, our little region over here, which has never bothered anyone. Well, that was 1944. A couple of months later, the war was coming to an end. The United States was taking over from Britain, would be the global dominant power, much more powerful than Britain, and it was carrying out careful planning for every area of the world, including our little region over here. So in February 1945, the United States called the Latin American countries to a conference in Mexico where the law was laid down to them. And it happened to be almost verbatim what you just said. The State Department is very revealing. The State Department was concerned with what it called the philosophy of the new nationalism that's spreading over Latin America. And it has very dangerous features. One of them is, I'm virtually quoting, not even paraphrasing. One of them was that the philosophy is based on the idea that the first beneficiaries of a country's resources should be that country. Totally wrong. The first beneficiaries are US investors. And another flaw of the philosophy of the new nationalism was that it was seeking an increase in the welfare of the population and a broader distribution of wealth. Absolutely not. That doesn't happen in our little region over here. So in response to this, the United States imposed what was called an economic charter for the Americas, which eliminated economic nationalism in all its forms. Economic nationalism means development for your own population with social and egalitarian goals, flat out. It did allow, the charter allowed some degree of industrialization and development, but it said no excessive industrialization. Excessive industrialization means competitive with the United States. So Brazil could have a steel industry as long as it produced low-level steel that American steel companies weren't interested in. There's a bigger name for this. It's called comparative advantage. So when Adam Smith gave his kind advice to the American colonies, he told them, what you should do is pursue your comparative advantage in agricultural production, production of furs and so on. And you should get more advanced manufacturing goods from England. And that will be for the benefit of all. You'll benefit too. I'll benefit. England will benefit. That was in fact proven by the best economic theories. Still today, same principles hold. There's a very interesting historical observation. There are countries that pursued the principle of comparative advantage, mostly because they were forced to. They're called the third world. There are countries that totally violated it. They're called the developed world. Begins with England, which robbed superior technology from India while it proceeded to deindustrialize more advanced India, radical violation of imposed high tariffs. Then the United States came along and did the same. It rejected Adam Smith's kind advice and in fact stole higher British technology, set up tariffs, protective measures, industrial policy, developed. Same with every country in Europe. There's one country in the global south that was never colonized, so it couldn't follow, it wasn't forced to follow the principle. It's called Japan, the one country in the global south that developed. Actually, I was once invited, oddly enough, to give a talk at the Harvard University Advanced Economics Seminar. Interesting reason why I was invited, but I'll put that aside. But I figured I gave him what I thought was one of the best talks I ever gave. Fell flat. The talk was essentially this. I said, look, I have a thesis. It's got to be wrong because every economist says it's crazy, so it must be wrong. The thesis is that everything you're teaching is 100% refuted by history. And then I went through the record on comparative advantage, on the advice that Adam Smith gave, that they give today. Go through the record, one country after another. It's 100%. And not really surprising because it's almost true by definition. Comparative advantage means stay where you are. Development means change your comparative advantage. Okay, so it's not surprising that it's 100% verified. I said, look, I realize this has got to be wrong, but could you tell me what's mistaken? And they kind of nodded their heads and said, that's kind of curious. Let's turn to the next question.
Yeah, there you are again, the relation between facts and ideology. Also reminds me of Thomas Carothers, Latin America specialist, who said under Reagan, we always try to do good in Latin America and Central America, but somehow it never works. It never works in 100% of the cases.
Same is true in Asia. Take a look at Asia. There's one country, Asia has gone through what's called an economic miracle. Tremendous amount of development in the last 50, 60 years. One country is not participated, Philippines, the one country that's under US control. Is it pure accident?
Yeah, I mean, if you ask the people in Harvard, it probably is just coincidence. Yeah, and coming back to the question of facts and truth, I'm wondering how many people, how high is the percentage of people in the United States who would know about the facts that we've been talking about 10 minutes ago, like the boiling bloodbath in Indonesia, the actual number of the people killed in Indochina, the hundreds and thousands of people killed in Central America in the 1980s alone. How high would you think the percentage would be?
Maybe 5% at the out. Notice that in 1965, the whole educated class knew about it. I mean, everybody reads the New York Times, Time Magazine, quite frank about it. Boiling bloodbath, best news in Asia, and so on. But it's gone, who cares? It's a benign, it's a constructive bloodbath. So constructive that Bundy, one of the main architects of the war, said later, hadn't thought about it at the time, he said, we should have pulled out of Vietnam. It was pointless to go on, we'd won.
Yes, in terms of ideology, I think one of the things
incidentally, when you talk about numbers, you mentioned India and China. Let's take a look at that. What everybody knows, there's a famous book about it, The Black Book of Communism, is that 100 million people were killed by the communists, mostly in China. Well, I wrote a review. It got rave reviews everywhere, except for one. I wrote a review of it. And the review had two parts.
In Germany, there was also a very good book about the Black Book, which goes in the direction into which you are now going.
Oh, you wrote a review too?
No, there was a whole book. I had nothing to do with it, but it was very good and was a very, very good deconstruction.
Somebody did write a review of it?
Not just a review, it's a whole book, a book on the Black Book. I will try to get a copy and send it to you. It's very interesting.
I suppose what the book did was go through the evidence and show that it doesn't hold. That's only half the story. I barely mentioned that in my review. I mentioned something else that does hold. 100 million people. 100 million people is the number who were saved in China as compared with India. If you compare the demographic data for China and India during the Maoist years, basically 49 to 79, this was done by Amartya Sen, Nobel laureate in economics, who's a specialist in the region. He pointed out that because of the rural health and development programs in China, which were not carried out in India, 100 million people were saved in China, even taking into account the Great Famine, Great Leap Forward, and the other horrendous actions. Even taking that into account, 100 million people were saved by simply rural development and health programs. How many people know that? Well, I'll tell you something interesting about it. The article of Sens appeared in the journal. He's written a book too, but the article appeared in the Journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a lead journal. The article had two parts. One was about Chinese crimes. The other was about the India-China comparison. First part is well known. Second part is, I've never seen a reference to it except my own. That's the same article.
Yeah, what a surprise. I mean, actually, that book took a similar approach. I still remember very well the book talking about the neoliberal structural adjustment program utilized in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and how many million people were literally killed by that. And that's also something nobody knows. When Putin, who is the successor of Yeltsin, is demonized in the West, the background story is always forgotten and disappears into the memory hole. Same thing with elections. I mean, you had the 1996 re-election of Yeltsin, which was basically engineered by Washington. And now we are talking about how Putin is a dictator.
Well, actually, it was not basically engineered. Washington took credit for it. Clinton was very proud of the intervention to get his friend Yeltsin in there. That was during the 90s when Russia was accepted the shock therapy principle, moved quickly to a market. It was devastating. And GDP went down by about 50%, I think. The country was destroyed. Then there was some kind of reconstruction. Putin has, in fact, reconstructed the country in a very ugly way, but at least it's an economically functioning country. Actually, a kleptocracy with tremendous robbery by Putin and his clique of the country, yeah. But it's back to some degree of functioning. But that was another major success of one of the major successes of neoliberalism. But we have the same thing right in our own countries. I don't know if there's been a study in Europe, but there was a Rand Corporation study of the transfer of wealth in the United States during the neoliberal period, 1980 to the present, 40 years approximately. They estimated that $50 trillion, not small change, was transferred from the working class and the middle class to the top 1% during this period. That's class war on an impressive level.
Absolutely, yes. Before we move on to the book that has just appeared, Consequences of Capitalism, let's briefly go into the propaganda model for the Western media, because this propaganda model is the mechanism that kind of turns the facts of the world as they really are into the ideology we get by published and by intellectual opinion. How does that propaganda model work? There are 5 pillars that you develop in the book, one of which was modified when you wrote the new foreword in 2002. Can you briefly talk about that?
Yeah, first of all, let me make clear, if you notice, the book is Herman and Chomsky. I insisted over Ed's objection that his name come first. We usually, when we write together, it's just alphabetic. Yeah. But and I did that because this was mainly his construction. Ed was a professor of finance at the Wharton School. He was main academic work was on corporate power and corporate control. And the propaganda model is basically an institutional model. He basically designed it. He asked the simple question, what are the institutions of the media? Answer, major corporations, parts of bigger corporations sell a product to a market. The market is other corporations. The product is you and me. You have to sell the readers to the other businesses, all tightly linked to the government, which is itself mostly corporate controlled. So just by elementary common sense, not anything fancy, what do you expect to come out of this? Well, what you expect to come out of it is what the published or broadcast material is information structured so as to be in the interests of the producers, the consumers, and the connected institutions. Then the rest of the book is discussion of cases which illustrates it. One of the filters was anti-communism in 1988. By 2002, we realized that was too narrow. It's just having an enemy that you can hate.
Exactly.
That's enough. So
the enemy is exchangeable. It can be terrorism.
Exchangeable, yeah.
And is that or the other thing?
Same country can be a friend and an enemy, depending on what year it is.
Absolutely.
In 1964, Indonesia was an enemy. 1965 was a great friend. All that happened was a constructive bloodbath.
Yeah, and one of the things that you have often said when you talk about propaganda model is that it's actually the null hypothesis, even though those people who are affected by it cannot see the simple fact that was already expressed by Marx, that die herrschenden Gedanken jeder Epoche sind die Gedanken der Herrschenden. And you showed the mechanism. And if we look at other periods, we say, or other countries, we say nothing could be clearer than that. But once we look at ourselves, we are all of a sudden blinded to the fact.
Totally blinded. Can't look at ourselves, no matter how obvious the facts. It's, I mentioned before that, started to mention, even when the United States was condemned by the World Court for international terrorism, right in the middle of all the hysteria about international terrorism, passed virtually without mention.
Nobody noticed.
Not mentioned.
Even though I must admit that the German press has a broader range. It was not known in Germany. Nobody took notice. It was not interesting. And the very fact that United States refuses to sign so many international conventions, and if they do it, they say that's valid for others, but not for us. That also basically goes unmentioned. Let's now move on to the new book, to the one that's not going to appear in German, but has just appeared, namely Konsequenzen des Kapitalismus, German subtitle, Der lange Weg von der Unzufriedenheit zum Widerstand. That's based on lectures and seminars Marvin Waterstone and you gave. I believe from 2017 on, when you moved to Arizona, until 2019. And then you had to drop it because of COVID. Is that right?
No, we didn't have to drop it. It's interesting. If the state legislature ever found out what we're teaching, it would be banned. But fortunately, they're too incompetent to find out. So we continue to teach it. We've been teaching it for I think about 6 years, just now planning the next year.
Wow, cool.
Marv is emeritus professor of very knowledgeable, serious Marxist economist. We divided up on a variety of topics. We also bring in activists from many areas who give lectures on their work. It's quite interesting to do it in Arizona. It's a pretty reactionary state. It's an undergraduate course, so we're getting students who've never heard a word except patriotic propaganda.
That's interesting.
They're very interested, do good work. It's a mixed class. We have undergraduate students and an open class for open enrollment for adults who want to come in on an adult education program.
Is that taken up a lot?
Oh, yeah, quite a lot. It's about probably more than half.
So you are not actually teaching mostly to people who already are on the same page with you, but to people from all walks of life and opinion?
It's a pretty good grouping. I mean, I'd like it to be even broader, but the students are just, undergraduates who happen to be interested in politics. The older people are people mostly who have some kind of activist interest or something, but it's drawn from a fair sample of a broad public. It would be very nice to be able to reach still broader constituencies. Yes. That's not easy. I sometimes do. I do it whenever I can. If I'm invited to a gated community of retired people, which is mostly wealthy people, I'm glad to do it. And pretty much the same discussions.
What I was wondering when I was translating, these are pretty long lessons or lectures. Is there a lot of interaction with the students after the lectures?
We have special sessions of discussion with the students where they bring up questions. We discuss the questions. The students discuss with each other. But those aren't in the book. A few of them happen to make it, but not much.
Yeah, I think that would maybe an interesting project for the future, seeing this interaction. One of the books of yours I like tremendously is Understanding Power, because it contains so much of this interaction. And it's not just Noam Chomsky talking, but it's Chomsky interacting with other people, and everyone can give their own approach. And
that book has another, it's one of my favorite books too. It was just discussion, but there are two public interest lawyers who worked on the book and set up an internet page of references, which is an invaluable resource, incredible resource. It's they checked up all the things we were talking about, put up references for them.
Yeah, it's absolutely fantastic, and it's thicker than the book itself. It's more than the book itself. Okay, so in the
two guys who are public interest lawyers, not corporate lawyers.
Yeah.
They're just public defenders and things like that.
So in the first two chapters of the book, you basically deal with what you call the taken for granted, or what Antonio Gramsci would have called hegemony. Can you say a few words about that?
Well, I should say it has traditional roots, as we point out. It goes back actually to David Hume.
Absolutely, yes.
David Hume, in the first major modern book, and what we call political science, opens the book this is 350 years ago, by saying he's amazed by what he calls the easiness by which the great majority accept the rule of a tiny minority. Said power is in the hands of the governed. Why do they accept authority from above? He says the only possible answer to this miracle is consent. They didn't use the phrase, but they have consent manufactured and they accept it. And therefore they subordinate themselves to power.
That's actually one of my favorite quotes from all the quotes from classics that you give. The Jung quote is one of my favorites.
But Gramsci later called hegemonic common sense, that it's just the dominant ideas in a society which typically reflect the power structure, and people just accept them because how can you question them? And they're very interesting examples, like one of the ones we discuss going into the history a little, is the idea of having a job. So you get out of college, your highest goal, or high school, your highest goal is I got to get a job. How could there be anything better than getting a job? What is getting a job? A job means being essentially a slave for most of your waking life, taking orders, following orders, being told what to dress, what clothes to wear, when you're allowed to go to the bathroom, who can you talk to. That's the way you spend your waking life. You go back to the 19th century, this was considered an intolerable assault on human dignity. The working classes, they never heard of Marx, just on their own developed a massive labor movement, Knights of Labor, based on the idea that nobody should accept this assault on human rights and dignity. We should be, those who work in the factory should own them. We should be free of the orders of absentee owners who try to tell us what to do. We run things by ourselves. The populist was mostly an agrarian country then. The populist movement of independent farmers is very much the same.
There you have the much maligned populism. There is another variety of populism.
That was real populism.
Which is very good.
They wanted to develop a cooperative commonwealth of farmers who would run their own affairs, not Northeastern bankers. They would run the marketing, the development, the lending that was necessary, and so on, and work together. That's 19th century. Well, consent has been imposed so that what was intolerable then is the highest goal today. That's pretty impressive.
In one of your recent interviews, you also talked about David Graeber's book, Bullshit Jobs. And I guess this is another facet of it. Bullshit jobs, I think, can be understood in two ways. For one thing, you are a wage slave and have to do all the things that your masters order you to do. And for another thing, a lot of what's being done in those jobs is completely useless or even worse. I was just discussing this with friends because there have been modest steps in Germany to support public transport. But if you look at the car industry, what this essentially amounts to in a situation like this with climate change, its high-level waste production could be reduced by at least 80%, changing everything to rail cars and buses and public transport, and the people could have a good time and go home after 4 hours.
That's very interesting. That raises a very interesting question about consent, because this came very close to happening in the United States. couple of 10, 15 years ago. In 2009, after the recession, the government, this is Obama now, basically nationalized the auto industry. The auto industry was collapsing. Obama took it over. Government basically owned almost all of it. There were two choices they could have made at the time. One of them was to to bail out the industry, turn it back to the former owners, have them keep producing what they were doing, namely what you just described, sitting in a traffic jam for a couple hours a day, polluting the atmosphere and so on. There was another possibility. They could have turned the industry over to the workforce and the communities and have them produce what we need, efficient public transportation. If there had been popular consciousness at the time, popular movements could have pressed for that. We'd all be much better off. The environment would be much better off. But just the lack of public organization, understanding, and activism meant that the worst possible course was picked. Well, we're pretty close to that today. Take today. My colleague, Robert Pollin, yes, economist, done the major work on how to deal with global warming, a lot of economic detail. He's pointed out that right now, the government could take over the entire fossil fuel industry, essentially buy it, at a fraction of the cost that was used to bail out the financial institutions after the COVID crisis, when they took a hit. So it's not out of sight. Could nationalize them, turn them to sustainable energy. If there was popular backing and understanding.
Essentially, it would be better for everyone, but as usual in the last years, we pick the worst option. And since our time is slowly running out, let me get to another example of picking the worst option, and that would be the current situation in Ukraine and Russia. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
First of all, it's criminal invasion, no justification for it. An invasion, aggression like that can end in two ways. One of the ways is a diplomatic settlement. The other way is capitulation by one side or the other. Till you get to one of those two, the war just goes on. That much is logic, okay? So let's look at those three options. The option of diplomatic settlement, by definition, means both sides tolerate it, even if they don't like it. So a diplomatic settlement says, well, I'll accept this as better than the alternatives, even if I don't get what I want. That's what's known as a diplomatic settlement. That's one possibility. You reject diplomatic settlement, the war goes on till one side capitulates. It's not going to be Russia. We know that. If in the very unlikely event that Russia faces defeat, it has weapons it can use to destroy Ukraine and, in fact, much more. So that's not going to happen. So you go on with the war. And meanwhile, what happens? Kill a lot of Ukrainians. Tens of millions of people face imminent starvation because of the closing of the Black Sea region breadbasket, and the risk of nuclear war increases. So we basically have two choices. Shall we seek a diplomatic settlement, or shall we move to massive destruction? Ukraine, sacrifice Ukraine, tens of millions of people elsewhere, maybe go on to terminal war. Those are the choices.
There's one thing in what you just said that kind of surprises me all the time, even though probably it shouldn't. You say Russia is unlikely to lose, and I think everybody with his marbles together can see that. But by virtue of one of the principles, there is a small book with 10 principles of war propaganda, which is very interesting. And one of the principles is the enemy is on the verge of losing. And they've been saying that about Russia right from the beginning. There is a collection of headlines that would almost be funny if the matter were not so serious. They are running out of tanks, they are running out of ammunition, they are running out of soldiers. And if we keep at this, we will weaken and destroy them in the end. Unlikely to happen, but the people who say that apparently even believe it.
Well, suppose it's true. I don't think it's true, but suppose it's true. Everyone who, to borrow your phrase, has his marbles in place knows that Russia has weapons that it can use to devastate Ukraine and to set the stage for nuclear war. So suppose let's imagine that Russia's about to be losing the war, the opposite of what we're seeing now, incidentally. We're seeing the opposite. But let's suppose it's true. Suppose it gets to the point that Russia might lose. Are they going to just go away quietly and say, oh, too bad? Or are they going to use the weapons that we know they have to win the war? I mean, you don't have to be a genius to figure this out.
Not really.
But in fact, it cannot be figured out in the West. You can open this morning's latest report of the Atlantic Council, a highly distinguished institution. Elliot Cohen, old neocon, has an article saying, we can't just defeat Russia, we have to destroy it. We have to make sure that Russia, Russia delenda est, nothing left. We have to do that. And meanwhile, while we're doing that, Russia's just going to sit there quietly and say, oh, this is fun. The level of lunacy is beyond discussion, especially when you think what the stakes are.
It's another example of manufacturing consent, and consent that has already been manufactured among the media and many, many journalists. I mean, from time to time, I send you something from Der Spiegel, and you say, in the United States, it's still worse, even though that's hardly believable. And in the end, it really amounts to irrationality. And before we end, let's quickly move to another example of capitalism-induced irrationality, namely the prison industrial complex in the United States that you also mentioned in the book. I mean, there has been an amazing development in the United States since the 1970s, from a base which was already very high, but not off the chart. Namely, something like 400,000 prisoners in the United States in the 1970s. This has exploded to a high point of 2.5 million in 2010, has slightly receded since then. And that's also already been called the penal state. And when I mentioned my surprise about this development to our mutual friend, the late Lilac Lightman, she said, Michael, you must not forget that this country was founded by religious fanatics. Do you think this is a factor in this?
The country was, in fact, founded by religious fanatics, and it's an unusually religious country. There have been great revivals right through the whole period of the country. If you look at statistics today, the level of religious belief is incredible and having a huge effect on policy. I'm not sure that that is the major factor in the huge increase in the incarceration rate. Notice that it coincided almost exactly with the neoliberal programs.
Yes.
And one of the things that the neoliberal programs did was say to the working class, you're worthless. We don't have anything for you. The first move of Reagan and Thatcher, first move was to attack the labor unions, destroy them, opening the door for corporate assaults on labor. Perfectly sensible. We're going to launch a war against the working class. We got to eliminate your means of defense. Well, what do you do when you have a lot of people that there's nothing to do with? One thing you can do is throw them in jail. You actually get a workforce out of that, because out of prison labor, but that's a minor part. But you essentially just get rid of them. We have nothing for you. We're not going to develop a society in which you have a place. I don't know if that actually has occurred to anybody's mind, but it's a perfectly natural connection.
I mean, the book has few graphs, but the graphs it does have in it are very interesting, and that's what you just mentioned. You have a curve of the GNP that goes like this, and you have the share of the workers that goes until 1970. It follows it very closely, and then in the first years of the 1970s, there is a breaking point and becomes flat. And that's apparently what happened, and would coincide to the production of what you mentioned, a surplus population that you somehow have to deal with. And one way to deal with it is throw them in prison.
And there are many devices to do it. One of the devices is the drug war, which also expanded in this period. There was actually the drug war sort of starts with Nixon, but Nixon, who was in many ways the last liberal president, had a fairly
environmental agencies and stuff like that.
Yeah, right. He had a fairly sensible component to it. There was a prevention and treatment component, was part of the drug war. Now, there have been major studies, some of them Rand Corporation again, which showed that the most cost-effective way to deal with drugs is prevention and treatment. The most effective, least cost. The less effective, more cost is repression, police measures and incarceration. Still worse than that, and more costly, is border controls. And the worst of all, most costly, least effect, is out-of-country operations, like the chemical warfare operations in Colombia, which destroy crops and livestock and peasant life in order to eliminate heroin production. Then you look at the way the policies are, the reverse. Exactly the reverse. The least expenditure is used for prevention and treatment. Okay, and then it goes up all the way. Well, what that should, in fact, there's an even further question. Why the illegalization in the first place?
Yes.
I mean, tobacco is far more lethal than marijuana. I mean, incomparably more. It's not criminalized. Coffee is, overuse of coffee is harmful, not criminalized. It's, in fact, there's a long history of drugs. And it turns out that the drugs that are criminalized are those of the so-called dangerous classes.
Yes. So for one thing,
population that you're afraid of we criminalize through drug laws. This goes way back to the 19th century.
So for one thing, in reality, it's not about helping people or solving some problem. It's about class war against the underclass. And the United States, I think, has not just the United States, but we know that it's particularly severe in the United States, has also another component. It's not just that the people who you find in prison are poor. It's also racialized. It's heavily racialized.
It's very highly. The percentage of Blacks imprisoned for comparable offenses is way out of sight. But it's whoever you were quoting before, the country is not only founded by religious fanatics, but also by extreme racists.
Exactly. Yes.
Country. White supremacy is deeply rooted in the country. And we see it right now very clearly.
Yeah, and that brings me to my final point.
I can't make that comment without adding something else. In my opinion, Europe is even more racist than the United States. It's just less blatant. When the issue arises, say in Denmark, of 2% of the population not being blue-eyed and blonde-haired, they go berserk.
Yeah,
okay.
So thank you very much for this. Let me finally give Valeria Chomsky and Noam have a pet at home, the parrot Ziki. Unfortunately, he's not with us, but I'm using my own as a substitute.
What?
This is for you.
What is it? What is it?
The parrot is now saying, long live the international solidarity of all people.
Okay, good,
So,
very good.
After all the horror we've been talking about, we end with a positive note. And thank you, Valeria, for also showing up in the picture. All best for the next interview. Bye-bye.